Hello guys, today's video is going to be a focus on the UI system within Inquisitor Martyr and how it can be improved. I was originally making this video as a developer feedback video, but wanted to share it with you guys to give you a little bit of insight into how my brain works with these games and to how I think feedback should be given and how we can break down and analyse the UI. I'd like some of your opinions as well, as I think if we gang together with this and we get enough feedback that's consistent, the developers have already said to me that they'll make any changes that they feel will be improvements. So before we get started into the video, just remember to click the subscribe button, press that little bell next to it. That way, if I release any new content, you can stay up to date and not miss anything.
Do it!
Yeah.
Yes, you can!
Yeah.
Just do it!
So starting off, I just want to say that we may have a little bit of bad luck when doing these comparisons, because the first mission we've been given within Inquisitor Martyr is an abandoned space station that happens to be a gunmetal grey primarily, which overlaps hugely with the current UI. The other 9 map types may not clash so much, but going from this is where we spent the majority of our gameplay thus far. I can say the UI colour scheme and the map colour scheme are currently a little bit too close. Yes, they have to be of the same palette, but what you'll notice in the comparison chart that I'm going to bring up here, comparing Path of Exile at the bottom, Diablo 3 second one up, Inquisitor third up, and Van Helsing at the top, what you'll notice is there's always a contrast of light and dark within these user interfaces. A fairly small and limited colour palettes, but the contrast between light and dark means there's very clear defining edges of where the UI starts and finishes. You'll notice if we compare this to Inquisitor Martyr, there is almost like a brushed pixelated effect to the overall UI, which makes it quite unclear as to actually where one bit of it starts and another one stops. If, for example, you concentrate your attention to the weapon swap button just next to the furthest left chainsaw, you'll see that it's a fairly dull looking button over a washed out sort of grey panel, which is then on another grey panel. It's not really clear where one thing starts and another stops, whereas you compare that with the other 2 panels down below, we have very clear defining images and much more simplistic, it has to be said. We've got 2 orbs being held by some statue of a naked lady, and we've got a gargoyle of sorts holding onto your health orb. It's really simple stuff, but that's really all that's needed. I think the Inquisitor Martyr UI is trying to cram a lot of different textures and parts and pieces into this area, and as such a lot of the detail is actually lost due to having too much detail in such a small area. And what that's done is it's prevented the ability to have contrasting light and dark, giving very definable edges. We'll come back to that in a moment. Also, on the subject of colour, I want to divert your attention towards the health bar, which I think for me at the moment is something that needs to be tweaked. Now, we have the limitation of it being a bar. Most ARPGs will go for an orb, and I don't think the bar itself is a problem, but naturally it's going to be less visual. It's going to be harder to spot it going down compared to a red circle that's slowly emptying in other games. It needs to be visible, but actually Inquisitor Martyr has gone for a deeper, darker red. I would argue it's more blood-like, and hats off to them, and I love the colour, I love the effect there, it looks beautiful. But it's too dark. If you're looking at the centre of the screen and this thing's ticking down, it's not actually very obvious if you're losing health and how low your health is. I would say if they change the tone very slightly, it's going to be much more in tune with games we're used to playing, and you're not going to find your characters actually drop to a quarter health without realising. You've also got to take into account that this is right in the corner of the screen, whereas some other games will have this more central. Therefore, it needs to be even more visual to your character. It needs to stand out even more. Another current issue is it's also surrounded by the suppression system, which I think is absolutely fine, but that really overshadows the health. Presently, you can tell if your suppression's going down far more easily than your health by quick glance, and I know you can go over to that part of the screen and you can stare and have a look at it, but the fact about UI is it needs to be quickly presenting you with information so your eyes don't have to be there for too long. This is something I think is currently a bit of the issue for the health, as it really is just overshadowed. I'd like to also compare this with the armour ability, where you'll see a slow sort of rev meter build up around it. My issue with this, and it's a very small gripe, but I think it's very, very important, is as it builds up, the colour becomes bolder, which is consistent with what you might see in a car or, I don't know, a jet fighter if you've been in one. You're going to have brighter and brighter colours as it gets more and more dangerous. However, it's actually when it's lower that we need to know exactly how much we've got. And what happens at the moment, when you've got about a third full, it's not very clear at all how much you have, which for me is the exact opposite of what we want. Now, I'm not saying it should be brighter at the bottom and darker at the top, but I think a much better contrast in colour is needed. You compare this with the experience bar within Diablo 3, or even if anyone's played Guild Wars, I'll just bring up a small picture here. If you've played Guild Wars, you have a very, very clear image of how many of these little points you have at the bottom as to how much of an ability you can use. It's really beautifully clear. Even compare this with the bottom right mana pool of Path of Exile. Even when it's nearly empty, I can look down there and in a split second I can tell exactly how much I have, or even out of the corner of my eye I can see it's emptying, and I can see that I may only have a third full, a quarter full, half full, but it's much, much clearer, whereas this currently, especially with the Assault Pack, blends in far too much. Now, that takes care of the colour palette. I've already mentioned thus far, just as a quick sort of conclusion of what we've said thus far, is within the UI there's currently not a lot of contrasting colours. There is a lot of mid-range greys that all seem to blend in one, and we don't have very many contrasting shapes and figures within UI, making it look washed and pixelated and slightly more sort of woolly. As well as that, the health bar, a little bit too dull, a little bit not quite visible enough, and we have the armor ability again. The cooldown on there is very hard to see how much of this resource you actually have. Something else that we could maybe use to make this UI slightly more visible and have slightly more of a punch to it, if we go down to the Diablo 3 UI, you'll see there's a very, very clear black border around this of just a few pixels. It's not very many, but it's enough so that if you're in a dark room, or rather a light room, then the dark outline will contrast, and if you're in a light room, Flekiverki will then contrast. So whichever setting you're in, you're safe. You'll see Path of Exile does slightly a different sort of route. It has a mixture of light and dark, again within sort of intertwined into a string-like border going around the edge. But again, this means if you're in a light setting or a dark setting, there's a very clear contrast. We do have a very small border around the UI within Inquisitor. I would argue that maybe they could try doing just an extra pixel or two to make this actually stand out a little bit more from the map, or maybe just tweak the colours, the brighter one slightly brighter, the darker one slightly darker, to make this pack a little bit more punch to the eye. But of course they've got to keep this consistent with the game thus far. Now, a whole nother topic I'd like to talk about is the actual abilities, because there's going to be some criticism towards them, because from a certain point of view they could be construed as being lazy. By that, let's have a look at the shield abilities to begin with. They're very, very basic. Now, there is an advantage to this, because the abilities here very clearly indicate what the move does. They're almost like a tooltip, but a visual tooltip. You don't really need to spend much time guessing what an ability does, whereas comparing that with Path of Exile, an ability's aesthetics in terms of what its button looks like is not very clear as to what the move does. However, what tends to happen in these games, once you've been playing a game for a while and you learn which move is which, is you very quickly associate the colour and the icon with the actual ability you're using. In terms of any MMO and any ARPG, the colour and the general appearance, effects and image all blur into one thing, and your eyes will glance at it for a split second, and then you know exactly what move that is. I have the feeling that within Inquisitor Martyr it's going to go the opposite way around. We're going to quite quickly pick up what the skills are because it's nice and obvious, and we can always look down and reference, but I don't think it's ever going to be possible to very quickly reference these images with your eyes and instantly know which one's on cooldown, aside from it being 1 to 4. I did notice that the developers used to have individual skill icons with their own unique colours for weapons within their pre-alpha footage. Clearly they've decided to go away from this, but I don't know if it necessarily needs changing, but there is a little bit of a danger, I feel, in having all of these buttons looking so similar, especially when you come out with something like the bolter guns or heavy bolters. It may benefit from a little bit of a review, and I'd be really curious to hear what you guys think. If you've been an MMO player or something like that, if you feel that having really unique red buttons, green buttons, blue buttons is sort of necessary for them to look adequate, yeah, I would probably be of that opinion. However, I do see the value in these very simplistic sort of tooltip styles, because it does give the player a very clear indicator of what the move does, such as the Eviscerator here. We've got a chainsaw, we've got a swipe, we've got a triple swipe, and we've got an AoE. It's very, very simple. Grenades, on the other hand, I feel are just generally a little bit bland, and perhaps a little bit more colour within those may be required. Perhaps not. And that actually concludes all of the things I'd like to mention about the UI. And somehow this has ended up being a fairly long video, but the TL, the DR of all of this is really that the contrasting colours within the UI are far too similar. There are not too many lights and not too many darks, or really I think there's a lack of darks more than lack of lights. There's not a decent border around it that's very clearly visible. Some parts around the suppression, yes, there's a clear circular border, but in other parts, say around the armor ability, that the border sort of blends in with the background of this map. As well as that, the health I don't think stands out enough. I would quite like a glow effect to be emanating from the sort of status bar of the suppression effect as well. And the resource for the armor ability is not very visible at all, and gets harder to see the less you have of it. As well as that, I think there's some debate to be had around the weapon skills and such, but other than that, the UI is not too bad. I like the general look of it. The map on its own is a separate feature altogether. The buttons need to be clearer there. I can't even tell you where the buttons are from looking at it. They just need to be clearer. And on that subject too, the 1, 2, 3, 4 is kind of hard to visualize on the Inquisitor Martyr game. I would say the fact that several people in the forums have said, how do I use an armor ability? They haven't even seen the numeric 4 there. Maybe it's just their graphics cards or settings, etc. But I think that does show, if you have a look at any of these other tooltips, it's really clear and obvious. I'm not saying they need an overhaul or anything like that, but perhaps a little bit of tweaking might make this a little bit more user-friendly. We'll do a separate video on the general interfaces of the game at a later point, but I wanted to just give this to the devs to give them something to think about. Again, give you guys something to think about and talk about. I'd love you to put your thoughts into the comments below so you can share it with the developers. They said they will listen. Anything we tell them, they will listen to, so if you don't like something, please say so. Let us know what you think, and guys, hope you enjoyed the video. Remember to like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.